Thanks for joining us on a road trip through rabbinic narrative. No agenda, just clarity. So after 37 chapters of Sefer Iyov, describing Iyov's suffering, how it affects his relationship to God, the back and forth between Iyov and his friends, we finally get to hear from God himself. In Perek Lamed Ches, Hashem begins speaking to Iyov. Hashem doesn't provide Iyov with an abstract, theological, philosophical discussion about theodicy in order to answer his questions. Instead, he provides numerous examples illustrating the fact that he is the creator of the world and that he's involved in sustaining the world. One of the examples he gives really stood out to me. At the end of the Perek, he gives an example about baby ravens. The pasuk says, Mi yachin la'orev tzedo, ki ladav el kel yishaveyu, yitu libli ochel. Who prepares nourishment for the raven when its young ones call out to God, helpless without food? So the pasuk seems to be providing a particular example where Hashem is involved in sustaining a certain species of animals, and it portrays the baby ravens as hungry, calling out to Hashem for food, and Hashem providing them with food. But Chazal here completely changed what's going on. The Metzudas David quotes a Chazal that gives an explanation to the choice of baby ravens in this pasuk, which says the following: Al ki b'nei ha'orev hema levanim bi'aldusam. So since the raven chicks are white when they're born, ve'avihem ro'eh atzmo shachor vehema levanim, and the fathers see that they themselves are black, but the raven chicks are white. They come to the conclusion that these chicks must be, so to speak, mamzer chicks, and that another type of bird, mated with the mother. And because of this, the baby chicks are disgusting to them, and the fathers refuse to feed them. V'hamakom mazmin lahem yetushim mitzoasam v'nichnasin letoch pim lema'achalam. And Hashem arranges for worms to be present in their excrement so that it can enter the baby chick mouths to feed them. V'cha omer eich im kein tomar she'enini mashgiach bashvalim. And so Hashem is saying, if this is the case, how could you possibly say that I am not involved in matters of the world? Now, this seems to be an interesting Chazal in terms of the zoological reality that they're portraying. But it's hard to understand why Chazal are even stepping in here, and what are they even explaining? What have they added to this pasuk? The pasuk already says that the baby ravens call out to Hashem and Hashem feeds them. Why are Chazal now giving us this whole backdrop about how the father chicks abandon the baby ravens, the mechanism behind that, and how Hashem comes to actually feed them? What is being added by this? Now, one possibility is that Chazal simply wanted to tell us why is it that baby ravens were chosen in the pasuk, and why it is that they would be particularly hungry over any other animal. But I wonder if they're doing something a little deeper than that. Notice what Chazal did here. They didn't just make baby ravens really, really hungry chicks. They completely changed the story. They're abandoned chicks. Now, I did some research, and it turns out baby ravens are fed by their parents just like any other bird is. So I don't think that Chazal are just coming here to fill in some factual gaps to give us a little better context. But it seems like they are trying to portray a meaningful message for us to gain from this narrative they've created for us. And the question becomes, what is that lesson? What is the deeper meaning here? There is also an interesting fact towards the end, which is that it could have just said that because the baby ravens are abandoned and they need somehow to be provided with food, so Hashem makes sure that they get food or does some kind of miracle so that they get food. But the choice of words of Chazal that Hashem arranges for the worms to be present in the excrement is an interesting portrayal. And I wonder, is there anything we can learn from that as well? So let's think about this Chazal a little more. And again, what's interesting here is that the Chazal doesn't just make the baby raven a really hungry bird, but they actually portray the baby raven as an abandoned bird. Baby birds or infant animals or even baby human beings, because they are not capable of sustaining themselves or going out and finding food for themselves, they rely on their parental unit to provide them with food. Every animal is like that, right? That's the natural way of the world. That is, so to speak, how Hashem embedded in creation the ability of the young to survive, by ingraining in the instinct of the parent to provide for the baby. But in this Chazal, the baby raven is encountering a very serious problem, which is that because of the way that they are born, instead of being sustained by the parent raven, they're being abandoned by the parent raven. Hunger is not unusual. Every young animal gets hungry. But what's unusual is when the very mechanism that Hashem designed to solve that hunger isn't there. And so now you have a case where the regular system of sustaining the young is not operative. The parents are gone. There's a hole in the system. This portrayal by Chazal of the abandonment of the baby ravens actually reminds me of another category of people who face a similar problem. That's the Yasam and the Almana, the widow and the orphan. In Perek Chaf Bet, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. So this is in the corpus of laws that were given to Bnei Yisrael right after Har Sinai. The Pasuk warns, Kol Almana v'Yasom lo se'anun. Do not abuse the widow and the orphan. But it also continues, Imane te'aneoso. If you actually do that, Ki imtsaok yitzak elai shamoa eshma tza'akaso. When they cry out to me, I am going to listen to their cry. And the next pasuk explains how Hashem is going to execute judgment on their behalf. Now, one way of explaining this, which I think is what Rashi is doing, is basically saying verbally abusing or taking advantage of anyone is not a good thing. And the pasuk is just using the Yasam and the Almana as an example, since they are typically less fortunate and weaker than other people, and so they are more likely to be taken advantage of. But I think there's more there. The Ramban on the pasuk explains why is it that someone would think they can take advantage of the Yasam and Almana. And he says, because you might think that as opposed to everybody else, they don't have someone or they don't have an intermediary to protect them from other people. And so therefore, they are the most vulnerable and they are, so to speak, easy prey. But Hashem is coming to tell you, no, you're making a huge mistake. It's true that the widow is missing her husband, her protector, and the child is missing his father, who's supposed to be his protector. They might not have the typical intermediary that everybody else has access to. But in this case, I am going to function as the intermediary. I am going to function as their protector. The Yasam and the Almana, they're not necessarily poorer than everybody else. Their defining characteristic is that they've lost the ordinary human structure that was supposed to take care of them. Hashem comes in and says, even though it looks like they have no one to protect them, it's not really true, because I will come and protect them. When they call out to me, I will respond. I always wondered why the pasuk added that Hashem will respond to their cry. Hashem responds to everybody's cry. And why wouldn't he respond to their cry? But I think in line with the Ramban, we can see that here the response to the cry is reflective of the fact that Hashem has already taken this into account for the Yasam and Almana. He's not just responding to an unfortunate situation, but he has actually addressed these situations from the get-go. Here, it's actually part of the reality and the system of the Yasam and Almana. And I think this idea can be carried over to the Chazal by the baby chick ravens. The baby chick ravens are experiencing a very similar problem, which is that they are subject to a hole in the system. The normal way for them to get fed is not operative here. And it's not only that they're not being fed, but the way that they are born is what's causing them to be abandoned in the first place. And so what Chazal are saying is that Hashem already took this into account. Even though it seems like they're abandoned, it's already built into the system that they'll be provided for. That's what I think that point about the worms being present in the excrement is coming to point out. It's not simply that Hashem created the system, then he recognized a hole in the system which he responds to. But it's that even in the very system itself, he has come and arranged for the quote-unquote hole in the system to be filled. So now, Hashem's response to Iyov begins to sound very different. Iyov feels that somehow he has slipped outside of the system of divine justice. Because if Hashem's mishpat was operative, he wouldn't be experiencing the suffering that he's experiencing. His experience doesn't seem to fit into that system of mishpat, but instead of getting into a philosophical discussion about theodicy, Hashem does something very different. What Hashem does is he points to a creature that appears to have fallen outside of the system and shows Iyov that even though it looks like that, I have taken that into account and I have provided for that creature. So you might feel abandoned. You might feel like you don't fit into the system of mishpat that I have created for this world. But feeling abandoned and being abandoned are not the same thing. Perhaps this is why Chazal introduced this whole narrative to us. It's not really a lesson about baby ravens. It's a lesson about Iyov. Now, it is interesting to note that there are a few times throughout Tanakh where the raven is cast as a character in the story. The two places I'm reminded of are after the Mabul, Noach sends the raven out first, and the raven does not end up returning to the Teva. And by the story of Eliyahu declaring a drought for Bnei Yisrael, Hashem tells Eliyahu that he needs to go hide in the Nachal Keris so that he's not found, and that Hashem arranges for Orvim, for ravens, to bring food to Eliyahu to feed him. Now, it happens to be that there's a Chazal that Rashi quotes on the Pasuk to explain what was the raven doing that it didn't return to the Teva, which explains that it was flying around and waiting until another time in the future when the rain stops, and that's in the time of Eliyahu, so that it can go feed Eliyahu. It seems like Chazal are inviting us to connect these two stories of the ravens. Maybe a common theme between these two accounts is that these are both instances where the normal structure of the world is not really operative. By the Mabul, the world as it was known had to be destroyed and, so to speak, recreated. And in the world of Eliyahu, the normal way that Hashem provides for the nation through rain was suspended. And in both situations, the ravens appear. This would seem consistent with our idea about the baby ravens that Chazal are portraying, which is that when the natural world order that's supposed to exist and sustain is not operative, the raven is the perfect creature to play a role. So it started out as a Chazal that just appeared to be filling in some facts and teaching us a lesson in zoology, is actually teaching us a very deep idea, which is that even when it appears to us like this system that Hashem created, whether it's the laws of nature, whether it's the laws of hashgacha, whether it's the system of mishpat, when we feel like those are not operative, like there's a hole in the system that we are falling into, we have to remember it just appears that way. It's not really the way it is. Thanks so much for joining us. In our next episode, we're going to take up a fascinating Agadata in the Gemara, which describes how there was one Arab merchant who knew exactly where Korach and his Ada were swallowed up by the earth. See, he just happened to have a better GPS system than everybody else. See you on the next road trip.